My grandfather was a violin tutor in Russia to the Tsar's children, and in 1918 he had to flee in the revolution the day after the Tsar was arrested, and he was warned that he had to get away from St. Petersburg with the family, because being employed by the royal family anyway, and apart from the fact that he was Jewish, they were in great danger. And so they packed everything up that they had onto a handcart, and his brother and wife, their 2 children, the whole family walked. They wanted to reach Lvov first, but when they were on the outskirts, they met a group of women and children whose men and brothers and sons had all been murdered, and so they were warned not to go into the town. And they proceeded then on to Minsk, and again there was danger there, and they just felt that wherever they got to, there was still danger.
It must have been terrifying. Really.
Well, the only small consolation was that the severe winter weather had passed, but instead of that they were still experiencing very heavy blizzards and snow. They then eventually got to Odessa. When they got to Odessa, there were literally hundreds of refugees there as well, mostly Jewish, and they had to wait several days. Finally, a boat was given to them. Owner of the boat said, well, if I take you to England, which is where I'm bound, I'll take you for free passage if you will play to my passengers in the evening. And of course, grandfather jumped at the chance of that.
Because he loved to play anyway.
Well, he played whenever he could. Well, during the whole of that journey, neither my aunt or my father had been able to play their violins. They'd been left behind in England. So when they got to England, finally, they were settled in a ghetto in Leeds. And as soon as they did get to England, grandfather insisted that my aunt and father played his violin, because they didn't have any, and they soon became quite proficient again. Rosa was always the better violinist.
That was the daughter.
That was his daughter, my aunt. And my father passed a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music in London, because girls didn't get scholarships and they didn't get to London in those days. In 1936, she was invited to join the Birmingham Philharmonic in Germany. So she did that. By 1938, conditions in Germany had, of course, considerably worsened, and it became very dangerous if you were Jewish. On the night of Kristallnacht, which was November 38, she was arrested as she left the orchestra with the others, and they were taken to Mauthausen concentration camp. They did suffer terrible hardships, of course, but the idea there was they weren't there for any other reason than to work. And then in 1939, when Auschwitz was no longer going to be used for a Russian prisoner of war camp, my aunt was transported there together with several other hundreds in cattle trucks, and she was then put in to join the women's orchestra. At first, when she arrived and she had her head shaved and the numbers put on her arm, she thought she'd lost the violin. But when she was then enlisted into the women's orchestra, she was given the violin back to her amazement. And she continued to play in the women's orchestra. Each day they were allowed to play for an hour and rehearse. And then in the evenings they entertained the Nazi officers. Dr. Mengele would be there, and House, the commandant, Zeris, the commandant, Irma Gries, and very, very many others. Dr. Mengele, Dr. Death, was always present. And in January 1945, the rumour went round, the Russians are coming. And they did. And they were liberating Auschwitz, but not before those who'd been left alive, and there were only a few hundred by this time, were put into cattle trucks, taken by train to Belsen. Rosa then continued to play in the orchestra that was then formed in Belsen, and the English and Americans liberated them in April 1945.
It's Holocaust Memorial Day tomorrow, and one woman who lives in Shropshire has a busy weekend retelling her family's extraordinary story. Natalie Cumming, who lives in Pants, has written a book about it called The Fiddle. It centres around a violin owned initially by her grandfather in St. Petersburg, where he was employed as a music teacher by the Tsar. With the Russian Revolution, he and his family fled, walking to Odessa with their belongings and the violin. They made it to England, and the violin was eventually passed to Natalie's aunt Rosa. She was a talented violinist, and in the late 1930s was playing in Germany with the Berlin Philharmonic when she was captured by the Nazis. Natalie takes up the story.
On the night of Kristallnacht, which was November 1938, she was arrested as she left the orchestra with the others, and they were taken to Mauthausen concentration camp. And then in 1939, when Auschwitz was no longer going to be used for a Russian prisoner of war camp, my aunt was transported there together with several other hundreds in cattle trucks, and she was then put in to join the women's orchestra. At first, when she arrived and she had her head shaved and the numbers put on her arm, she thought she'd lost the violin. But when she was then enlisted into the women's orchestra, she was given the violin back to her amazement. Each day they were allowed to play for an hour, and then in the evenings they entertained the Nazi officers. Dr. Mengele would be there, House, the commandant, Zeris, the commandant, Irma Gries, and very, very many others. Dr. Mengele, Dr. Death, was always present. And in January 1945, the rumour went round, the Russians are coming. And they did, and they were liberating Auschwitz, but not before those who'd been left alive, and there were only a few hundred by this time, were put into cattle trucks, taken by train to Belsen. Rosa then continued to play in the orchestra that was then formed in Belsen, and the English and Americans liberated them in April 1945.
So what happened to the violin then after the war?
Well, after the war, when my aunt died, my father was given the violin, of course, and he played it every day until 1985 when he died. And I don't play, none of my family play, and I'm afraid it just laid in its box and went into decay. And then a programme called The Repair Shop was being shown on BBC Two. They wanted to use this story for one of the Repair Shop programmes, and it was completely restored by a very famous violin restorer called John Dilworth, and he completely restored it, found out inside that it was made in 1883 in the school of Guarnerius, so it was of a well-known school, and he reckoned that my grandfather was probably the first owner. Then it was played by another very well-known violinist called Christian Garrick on the television. As a result of this, I'd been trying to get the book published for some time without any success. Nobody was interested. A publisher came along and said, "I've just read your book. I couldn't put it down. I want to publish it." And it just took off.
Natalie Cumming from Pant in Shropshire, talking to BBC Radio Shropshire's Ryan Kennedy. You can hear more about the book The Fiddle on tomorrow's breakfast show. It's published by Michael Terence Publishing. You can buy it online for £8.99. The violin music you heard there was the actual violin that's been on this dramatic journey. It was being played by Christian Garrick on the BBC's Repair Shop. Now, here's an excerpt of the programme when she hears the instrument played for the first time in many years.
That's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
What is that song?
It's a wee song which I imagined today reading a bit of your history, and I thought we'd call it Rosa's Wishing Waltz.
Oh, can't believe it. Thank you so much. It is wonderful. It is wonderful. I don't have words to say.
I'm beside myself. The history of this violin, I'm grateful to be a part of it.
It's just incredible that you've been able to restore it as you have, so thank you so much.
I'm very pleased to have been able to help.
Thank you for playing. That was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I just feel overwhelmed. I didn't realise it would be restored to how I remember it being played 30 years ago. And it was just beautiful. The melody, the tone. I was suddenly transported back. I could see my father playing. It was beautiful, beautiful.
Isn't that something? You can feel the emotion in that. I'm delighted to say that John Dilworth, who restored the violin, and Jay Blades, the furniture restorer from the show, are both on the phone this morning. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Starting with you, John, thank you so much for coming on the programme. What's it like to restore a violin like that, knowing its incredible history?
Well, it was a first for me, really. I mean, when you restore instruments, often they're several hundred years old, and you sit and ponder about its history. But in this case, there was a very tragic story behind it, and a true story that was beyond speculation or guessing. I knew exactly what it had been through. So it was very difficult, and the realization that there were a lot of old repairs on the instrument that had to be removed before I could make it good. And I realized as I was doing it that those repairs were probably carried out in the prison camp to keep the instrument going. So that was a difficult job to sort of unpick this work that was part of the history of it, but it needed to be put back into playing conditions. So some of these things had to be done. But all the parts are still with Natalie, some pieces that I had to remove. So they still are mementos for Natalie.
What was it like to hear it or watch Natalie hear it for the first time in many years? It was clearly a special moment for all of you.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And she's her response was wonderful. I mean, I know Chris Garrick. He's a good friend of mine. I knew that he would get the best out of the violin, and that he was comfortable with the style of playing. And I knew it would be great. So, but Natalie's response was wonderful.
It really was. It was a marvellous moment to listen to. And Jay, Good morning to you. How fantastic to restore this violin on your wonderful programme.
Good morning. And good morning, John. I haven't seen John since we filmed that show. So, I'd say the violin is one of those special stories that is going to stay with the repair shop, everybody in the repair shop for, I think, a number of years, to tell you the honest truth. And what John has done, and I think John's been quite modest. In the repair shop, what we do is we find the best of the best craftsmen and women up and down the land to come and restore and repair items. And John, there's no one better than John to do that. And I'm quite chuffed that he was the guy to do it. I do. It's just choked me up a bit, I must say, because it's taken me right back to the time that we filmed it, and it was a really and still is a very special moment. So thank you, Natalie. I don't know if she's listening, but thank you for being part of the show.
What is it like to work on a programme such as that? I mean, that's a wonderful example of what can happen on the repair shop.
Yeah. Well, on the repair shop filming it, I'm the foreman, and basically what I'm supposed to do is keep everything together and just kind of be that the guy that makes sure all the jobs get done. But sometimes all of the stories are so emotional that it's very hard to keep it together. And it's one thing I love about a repair shop is basically how much history and how much wealth we have in this country that is kind of in people's garages, in lofts and so on and so forth, not being repaired, or those memories are still there. And the beauty with the repair shop is that we're able to just bring those back to life. It's just a real joy to work on.
Is it something that's in your blood, Jay? Have you always loved things like this?
I grew up in the 70s, and I remember the guy that used to come around with a wheel and he used to sharpen our scissors, and there was the guy that used to mend things. It was just part of my fabric. So to make, do, and mend, it kind of came from the 50s, and it was it was part of what I did, because when I was growing up, I didn't have much money. So the repair shop, for me, is just a modern-day version of that, where we're just celebrating the crafts that are still there and also the items that made us great. It's just, wow, the story attached to each item is just unbelievable. And
Jay, I also hear that you've moved to Shropshire in the Telford area now.
That's me, guilty as charged, sir. I live in Telford now. Moved up here from Wolverhampton and found love, and that's why I'm in Telford. Yeah.
Everyone loves Shropshire. There's a lot of love in the place. Now you've got a special job to do tomorrow, haven't you? Because Moore's Craft Centre in Jackfield in the beautiful Ironbridge Gorge relaunching, and you're guest of honour. Tell us about that.
Well, the Craft Centre, the Moore's Craft Centre, the craft industry is something very dear to my heart, and the development of endangered craft and just craft in general. By hosting a show such as The Repair Shop and also Money for Nothing, it's all about making do and mend and actually showing off what craft is all about. So for me to be there and support those guys, I'll be there all day, every day. And I've done a lot of stuff behind the scenes before this kind of event, and there's going to be more things that I do for them as well. So I'm kind of like a mentor, if that makes sense, of the whole craft centre.
What kind of things have you helped out with leading up to this point then?
Well, basically it's looking at social media, which is very powerful in this day and age, how you communicate, and then also getting everybody rallied around on the same kind of platform. So if you post something on social media, one thing that the group must be doing is actually like each other's posts, which will allow people to then be lifted up. And just looking at how we move forward in the future. So business-wise and getting footfall into the area. So me being part of that, looking to put some events on in the summer and just throughout the year, just planning the whole year basically to get people aware of what's going on in that part of town. Well,
Jay, keep up the good work. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
No problem. You guys take care.
Thank you very much. And John as well, thank you to you for coming on. Is it back to work, John, next week? Is it just restoration doesn't stop?
No, it's back to work 24/7 really. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. A wonderful achievement.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for sharing your story with us this morning. Thank you very much. Thanks, John. There we go. That's Jay Blades from The Repair Shop on the BBC, and John Dilworth there, who restored that wonderful violin. Don't forget, you can hear more from Natalie Cumming on Sunday's breakfast show tomorrow morning with Ryan Kennedy. She's also speaking to the South Shropshire Interfaith Forum this Sunday afternoon for Holocaust Memorial Day. You're very welcome to attend that. It's at the United Reformed Church on the High Street in Church Stretton at 2:30.
It's Holocaust Memorial Day, and Natalie Cumming from Pant will be telling her family's extraordinary story. It all centres around a violin that was initially owned by her grandfather, who lived in St. Petersburg, where he was a music teacher to the Tsar. With the Russian Revolution, he and his family fled, and the violin was eventually given to Natalie's Aunt Rosa, who was captured by the Nazis. She ended up in Auschwitz, playing the violin in the women's orchestra there. I've been to meet Natalie at her home, where she told me about writing the book, The Fiddle.
How was the experience for you writing the book?
Pretty emotional. There was one point where, even now if I read it, I well up. It's when my grandfather had the cart and they'd been walking and it was still winter, and they came to a river where the bridge had broken. They had to cross this river and the ice was on the river. And they knew it wasn't very substantial ice. So they took everything off the cart. And the women were all crying they couldn't get across. And, of course, the children were echoing their parents. They were upset. They took everything off and hand-transported it across this very thin ice, hoping that it wouldn't break, which it didn't. And then all that was left was my grandfather and an empty cart. And he started to walk across, and as he got to the middle, there was an enormous crack, and the cart went.
Yeah.
And he managed to run then across to the other side, and he sat down and cried. And that, to me, was the most poignant. I wrote it, but to me it was the most poignant.
What a story.
And they were then rescued by a very old shepherd who had sheep in a cave, a very large cave. and he took them in because they'd all become, they'd got very wet. They'd got water on their feet. They had no way of drying anything. They couldn't light a fire. They had no means of doing that. And he kept them there for several days and then set them on their way with plenty of dried meat and other provisions. And the next village they came to, they managed to get hold of a very old cart, and so they were able to carry on again.
What do you hope people will take from the book?
I hope they'll remember that there can never, ever be another occasion like this. We came very near to it in Serbia, from what I understand. I've spoken to several men in particular who have been to my talks, who were in the army, who liberated Kosovo and that area, and they said that the conditions they saw were appalling. But having heard the book, and now most of them buy it and read it, and then they come back to me, they say that no way must this ever happen again. That's the only thing I can hope. Never in my wildest dreams did I think the book would take off as it has. And now, just recently, a film producer has approached me, and I've now signed a film contract for either a film or TV series. They're probably talking more in the line of TV series because it's too many hours for a film. But this film producer is currently making a film in Israel with, I won't say the names, but two very well-known stars, American stars, and our own Hugh Bonneville from Downton Abbey. So he's making that as we speak. So he's in the big league. So I'm really hoping that once he's finished that, then he'll be able to get the same people on board to make my book.
How exciting.
Well, that is, yes.
Keep us posted, won't you?
Well, I will, but of course I've told them they better get on with it quickly because I might pop my clogs before then. At 81 I've got not that many years around.
I'm sure not. You seem very sprightly to me.
Well, yes, but the sprightly up here, but what is the expression? The mind is willing, but the body's weak.
Yeah.
My mind's telling me yes, but my body is telling me no. Natalie Cumming from Pant. Her book is called The Fiddle, is published by Michael Terence Publishing and available online for $8.99. And you can meet Natalie this afternoon when she speaks to the South Shropshire Interfaith Forum at the United Reformed Church in Church Stretton. That's at 2:30.